This video is called Aesthetic versus Academic. So I feel like I sit in this intersection of a Venn diagram between a world of people who only care about the aesthetics, like visual styles, vibes, charisma, and a world of people who only care about the academics, like classwork, research, and getting tenure. And I'm pretty shocked how little overlap there is. People on each side of this spectrum don't really take notice of anything happening on the other. Part 1. The academic side of things. So I went to college from 2015 to 2019, studying computer science and AI at Stanford University. When I was there, I was surrounded by people who cared a lot about academic rigor, and rightfully so. Every time we took a midterm exam, roughly every 4 weeks because of the quarter system, those exams had to be graded methodically. No room for bias or hand-wavy guessing. Whatever answer earned you 4 out of 5 points for question 18 should also earn every other student 4 out of 5 points for question 18, regardless of their race, gender, or even handwriting skills. I feel like this level of rigor is also due to the nature of the computer science field. It's fundamentally based off of a binary system of ones and zeros. Either your code returns the correct answer, or it returns an error. Here's an example. I remember I took the class CS 103, Mathematical Foundations of Computing, as a freshman. A big part of the final exam was that whole field about whether decision problems are verifiable or decidable or recognizable, that kind of stuff. This is also where that million-dollar question, does P equal NP, comes from. Anyway, there was this particular question on the test where I wrote a couple paragraphs to conclude that the answer was language A. But if you went by the rulebook, the correct answer was a set, and that set contained the one element language A. Technically, that is a distinctly different answer, so the TA marked my answer as wrong and called it a falsity. I remember petitioning for a regrade and just getting so pissy over that word, falsity, because I felt it was so pretentious. I mean, if I was wrong, just say wrong and be done with it, instead of all this pomp and circumstance of saying, you have committed a falsity. And I figured my reasoning was still intuitively on the right track, but this was all 8 years ago. So truthfully, I don't care about my score anymore, but the point I'm trying to make is that the comp sci department abides by meticulously well-defined rules of correctness. Here's another example, sanity checks. What's a sanity check? Well, most of our coding assignments required us to develop some tool, like an implementation of Microsoft Excel, or Photoshop, or a server farm, or a heap allocator. That one was the worst. To make grading easier, the teacher's aides didn't always look line by line through our code, and thank God, because that would be a chore. Instead, the course staff designed each assignment to have sanity checks, a set of handcrafted test cases for inputs to your program, along with the expected outputs your program should produce if everything's working correctly. For example, suppose your assignment is to write code that returns the square of the input. The sanity check file might include input 0, output 0, input 2, output 4, input -17, output 289, and input undefined, output undefined. Something like that. That way, as you're developing your code, you can run it against these sanity checks to make sure you match them, to feel confident you're on the right track. When it's time to turn it in, a chunk of your project grade is just defined by the number of sanity checks you passed. And the sanity checks you're graded with are, of course, not the same ones you get to play with while developing. Anyway, it's a very cut and dry, hands-off way to grade. You either coded that heap allocator successfully and it matched the sanity checks, or you didn't and lost those points. Not much room for ambiguity or debate. I understand why it is this way. Say you move from studying CS in college to applying CS at a software company in industry, like Microsoft. When your project manager needs you to implement a linked list stat, you'd better code one that matches all the specifications exactly. It should match every sanity check, edge case, and user input, but miss one semicolon and the whole thing could come crashing down. So it's important that CS students are aware of all the intricacies of how their code is working. And taking a step back, I do find the act of constructing code to find solutions in an efficient way as a sort of art form of clever epiphanies and innovations that is worthy of lifelong study and marvel. Dijkstra's algorithm, Hamming codes, context-aware scaling, all of these are really clever breakthroughs from intelligent minds. And I wouldn't have dedicated a whole YouTube channel to CS if I didn't find the field beautiful in its own way. Now, not all of a CS degree is like this. Of course, there's CS 181W, Writing in a Major, a class where you have to write essays discussing the ethics of implementing privacy policies in your code. Write it one way, and you might breach users' privacy, but write it another, and you might keep a criminal's smoking gun messages hidden forever. That's much more of an ethical gray area. But still, on the whole, the CS mindset heavily prefers rigor over aesthetic. And for 4 years, this mindset dominated the environment I lived in dominated Silicon Valley and dominated Stanford, this bastion of intellectual curiosity. Okay, I've made my point clear. That's the academic side of this Venn diagram. Now, contrast this with the world I entered directly after graduating, YouTube animation. Part 2. The aesthetic side of things. See, when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, I dropped out of school and focused on BFDI with my brother. BFDI is an animated web series we've been creating on and off since middle school, but it really ramped into high gear when everybody was quarantining indoors and had nothing better to do than watch YouTube videos. Anyway, I came to this realization that the world of animation, both indie YouTube and Hollywood, was starkly different from the CS world I'd spent my college years in. I realized that the factors that determined whether animated shows would prosper or collapse honestly boiled down to the vibes the characters gave off, whether they looked like someone you'd enjoy grabbing a beer with or not. Like, this was around the time that Sonic the Hedgehog film trailer was released, which featured a version of Sonic that everybody thought was ugly. Remember this? How there was enough unanimous public outcry that the studio delayed production of the movie to redesign Sonic to look friendlier? From what I can tell, it was mostly to make his face look more cartoony and expressive, which I do think was a good decision. Now, I know, the film enthusiasts out there will be telling me it's not just the vibes of the characters that matters. So does good storytelling, and good audio and visual quality, and good voice acting, and good world building. Yes, yes, and yes. All of this matters. But my point is that these factors are very gut feeling based. A lot of it comes down to whether the creative directors are like, I'm not feeling this one, or I'll know it when I see it, or ooh, that's a banger. You ask a computer to tell you which version of Sonic is better, and it couldn't say. I mean, using a bunch of if-then statements, can you even write a piece of code to determine which Sonic will appeal to more customers at the box office? No way in hell! And the same is true for the storyline or the world building. Use those as inputs for some computer program, and there's still no way to write code to know if it's a movie that will be critically acclaimed or panned. So there was consensus that the new Sonic looked better than the old one, but usually there's a lot more variety in what people like. For example, the version of Garfield that my friend John prefers might be different from the version of Garfield that my friend Susan prefers. I'm sorry, John, but it's a very subjective matter. As a movie studio, you might find yourself tugged between two sides, both equally heated and both equally unprovable by facts. And all you can really do is find a happy compromise that gets you as close to as many preferences as possible. Part 3. These two sides have no overlap. Now you can see how stark the contrast is between the entertainment industry and the academic world. Where do I stand on the spectrum? Well, I don't want to be like Sheldon Cooper from The Big Bang Theory and claim that factually correct is always correct, overlooking the importance of charisma and demeanor. But I also don't want to be like a sleazy car salesman, where if they talk smoothly and charmingly, that convinces more people to buy the car even if factually the car isn't very good. I really wish there was more overlap between the worlds of the academic and the aesthetic, but I find it's nearly non-existent. Let me paint a picture. I try to keep my social media feeds, like YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook, diverse, by following both the Stanford professors I took classes with years ago, and the digital artists whose styles I think look cool. And yes, this includes a lot of BFDI fan art. But whenever I'm scrolling through these posts, it's always plain as day which side of the divide someone falls on, and if they fall on one side, they have basically no interaction or awareness of what's happening on the other. Part 4. Pitfalls to only being academic. Here's some examples of why I think this is a drawback. Professors, for all the academic experience they've accrued, aren't known for experimenting with how to make an academic field engaging to a fresh, new audience. During my 4 years at Stanford, I found most 2-hour pre-recorded lecture videos by professors to be, brutally honest, a drag. I guess not being there in person and just watching it on your laptop in your dorm just doesn't have the same thrill. But they'd be filled with around 50% silence, or cleaning the board, or flipping through slides, answering boring questions from students who always sat in the first 2 rows, whatever. To be clear, I am grateful to have had the opportunity to listen to some of the greatest minds in computer science speak at Stanford. But I hope it's not too much of a stretch to say that being really good at research doesn't always correlate with being really good at communicating that research to freshmen in an engaging way. They're two different skills. As someone who spent years editing YouTube videos about computer science to a broader audience than just academics, I feel like it's almost illegal, in a way, to leave a video with even 3 seconds of silence when it could be edited out. Because on YouTube, there is an awareness that viewers have the option to click off whenever they start getting bored. There's an awareness that viewers prioritize their own time and enjoyment over finishing a class. And I wouldn't say it's entirely because they're lazy, even if it is partially. It's because the standards have risen for keeping content engaging across the board. I feel like if professors had an inkling of this sort of aesthetic rule of thumb, no 3 seconds of silence, they'd put in the effort to do the simplest reorganizing and editing of their lecture videos, which I'm convinced would increase the percentage of students who'd make it to the end. You might say, Gen Z students can't even sit through 3 seconds? Rest in peace attention span. But I think you're missing the bigger picture. Proportionally, I'm certain you could have most lecture videos and still maintain the meat of the academic material by trimming the unnecessary excess, like cleaning the whiteboard, etc. That's at least an hour of time. A great example of this is how 3 Blue 1 Brown's 20-minute video on Fourier transforms taught me more than a 10-week class on the same subject. And let's be real, we know college students are always so busy, struggling to fit a million clubs, classes, internships, whatever, into each day, which is why they're notorious for pulling the most all-nighters. So there are a lot more factors than just Gen Z needs to learn to be patient. It's also, as a sort of educational content creator, respecting your students' time and not overstaying your welcome with a 2-hour lecture video if it doesn't need to be that long. Now, I know editing is a laborious task, trust me, I know, but I'm not asking for the over-the-top jump cuts and transitions that modern Mr. Beast-style videos bombard you with. Just remove the silent sections, include relevant diagrams on screen in a way that is clear to read, and maybe use distinct character designs to depict historical figures like oversimplified. And have a TA do it if it's too time-consuming, because I'm sure a younger TA would be more tech-savvy after all. Here's a more salient example of academics overlooking style. Professors often give syllabuses at the start of each class, which are often white paper packets with the standard black text in Times New Roman. Included are the class calendar, grading system, rules and expectations, and so on. One common rule, especially in computer science, is no plagiarism. But in the year before I was a freshman, there was a huge scandal in Stanford CS, where something like 300 students were all caught cheating off of each other and all received Fs. Don't do that. I remember my RAs, resident assistants, sitting us freshmen down in the dorm lounge and lecturing us about not doing plagiarism before our big assignments were due. So the academic faculty will look at the situation aghast and scratch their heads just pondering, how in the world could this happen? We explicitly listed no plagiarism as a rule in our syllabus, and it's required for every student to read that. Did they forget how to read? But let's be real, none of us enjoy reading through any block of text that dense. Nobody reads the terms and conditions before clicking I agree. And again, some might say, Gen Z can't read through the rules, rest in peace attention span. These topics require thorough discussion, and if these kids can't even read through one page of it, our society is doomed. But I have a counterexample. See, in late 2023, H Bomber Guy released a video called Plagiarism and YouTube, which is a 4-hour-long video on plagiarism. It covers various stories of YouTubers like Illuminati and James Somerton committing quite blatant acts of plagiarism off of other typically smaller YouTubers. That video has 25 million views in just 9 months, and has certainly discouraged thousands of people from plagiarizing themselves. Now that H Bomber Guy has laid out so clearly why it's both bad to the original authors, and, if you're just focused on yourself, really cringeworthy for your image. I've seen dozens of YouTubers, including a few I know in person, say, ever since H Bomber Guy dropped that video, I've been more careful with citing my sources. Think about how remarkable it is that H Bomber Guy managed to get 25 million people to sit through 4 hours of discussion on why plagiarism is harmful, without having to pay for any marketing or obligating students to sit in a classroom for a mandated time period. And contrast that with how hard it is to get students to read through a syllabus for 5 minutes. What's the key takeaway? It's the aesthetics of H Bomber Guy's video that compel new viewers to want to watch and to want to side with him. The cadence of his delivery, how he alternates between jokes and serious explanations, the visual style of how he presents himself, and even the backgrounds. All of this is technically irrelevant from a factual academic standpoint, but it's crucial from an aesthetic standpoint, and it's what won him over the good graces in the minds of millions. I know it gets a bit cringe for me to glaze one person nonstop, so I do want to make it clear that H Bomber Guy hasn't fixed plagiarism, nor is he the only video essayist who's had an impact. Thousands of others also have, but I showed you this example to demonstrate how, by contrast, the colorless syllabuses that professors tend to give out are close to useless to truly convince students into new ways of thinking and behaving that they hadn't considered before. Lastly, and most importantly, I think academics can get stuck in an ivory tower way of thinking that has partially led to a culture war where many people outside the tower just don't believe them anymore, such as with vaccines. This is just from my perception of a super complicated situation, and no single teacher's behavior is singularly to blame for it, of course. Perhaps an academic may think, well, my interest is studying theoretical CS architectures at a PhD level. Trying to bring a commoner up to speed would take years, and is much more effort than it's worth since there's no guarantee they'll be able to contribute. I'll stick with discussing CS with my close-knit circle of equally educated colleagues, thank you very much. So, this thought process has some reasonable aspects to it. Students who excel at Algebra 1 should advance to Algebra 2 quickly. No need to hold people back from their full potential. But it's also led to non-academics to feel neglected, taking it upon themselves to see through the fog, as it were. And this fog has been caused in part by experts not speaking with commoners on a level playing field, but telling them in this condescending way, you just have to believe us because we're the experts. An example of this from my lifetime is that whole 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 equals negative 1/12 debate. So, non-academics, wanting truth but being skeptical of those who look down on them, invent ludicrous conspiracy theories. These theories have no scientific merit, but what they do have is a level of respect, camaraderie, and acceptance of the everyday Joe that the academics weren't giving to them. Maybe that respect isn't deserved, but this is about vibes, right? Am I saying that busy academics need to take even more time out of their day to appease a chaotic group of people who haven't shown them respect in return? No, I'm not, but it couldn't hurt to take a step out of the ivory tower every once in a while and talk about your field of study in an explain like I'm 5 sort of way. Maybe you won't convince the most far-gone lunatics, but I'm sure there are large swaths of independents in the middle who would appreciate the crash course lesson on the topic. And yes, I do believe that vaccines are one of these said topics. When one anti-vax person notices another in the wild, there's this instant sense of shared experience and shared outcast struggle that links them together even stronger. This makes it harder to convince them otherwise, even though vaccines have eradicated so many diseases they don't want. So yes, I do think understanding how to appeal to the general public has more ramifications than just narcissists gaining a lot of subscribers on YouTube. It can determine whether the next COVID-19 is an epidemic that kills millions, or is nipped in the bud because of widespread vaccine use, because the general public willingly chooses to use vaccines. All of what I said earlier about speaking styles, editing styles, and how to balance jokes with substance with H. Bomber Guy's video, I believe all of these are important aesthetic tools that hugely impact the culture of the next generation. But the academic world seems to neglect it for the most part. I just want to make it clear that I am not blaming colleges for the craziness that has happened in the conspiracy theory world in the last decade. The fault is fully on the conspiracists themselves. I'm also aware that many college professors do try to connect with the general public. MIT has famously put many of their well-known lectures online for anyone to see. I think that's really admirable. But still, on the whole, those are just a few of the drawbacks I've noticed, with the academic world keeping to itself and not really engaging with the wider public conversation. However, the aestheticians don't get to sleep so easily either, because I find there are also concerns when your whole life is only centered around aesthetics, and fact-based truth, being boring, doesn't play a role at all. Part 5. Pitfalls to only being aesthetic. On the most basic level, I noticed there are whole communities online where people get brownie points for dunking on bad art. Quote retweeting someone else's drawing by just saying stuff like, why does this look so garbage, and getting thousands of likes. We could get into a whole nother discussion about ways to give critique constructively, and my main viewpoint is that if people are posting for fun, then the response should be fun. And if people are posting to seek improvement, then the response can be critical, but all that's for another time. My point here is this: when someone online says, thing bad, isn't thing bad? Laugh with me at bad thing. If I turn off the subjective side of my brain and try to analytically figure out what is objectively harmful about it, there's often no solid ground to stand on other than cringe. So what does this lead me to think? Well, when I post something online to the people who have followed me for my aesthetic, there's a lot more fear I have that my post may be perceived to have that yikes vibe in some unmeasurable way. Will I get hundreds of replies saying, ooh, looks like Harry's losing his mind? It's like treading on thin ice, often impossible to predict until it happens. Whereas, when I post something online to the people who are fascinated by my academic-leaning work, like Scale of the Universe, I don't really have that fear. Sure, those types of content might not always go viral, like my special relativity videos, but if they don't make a splash, it's more that the crowd was too preoccupied by other things to take notice, and less that my failures are like a spectacle for thousands to gawk at. As Natalie Wynn mentioned in her ContraPoints video Cringe, if you're in an aesthetics-based crowd, it's like you're a clown in a circus, and the audience jeers at everything humorously bad about you. Don't get me wrong though, sometimes it's fun to be the center of attention, but sometimes I'm like, damn, the Scale of the Universe audience is way more civil, and I can rest the anxious side of my brain when I'm around them, and I really appreciate that, so thank you. But taking this a step further, when it comes to serious discussions between two sides, whether that's running for political office, or debunking allegations, or the vaccine issue I mentioned earlier, I noticed that coming out on top often boils down to a popularity contest. It's who can sell the audience the most aesthetically correct position, not the most actually correct one. Famously, if you want to sneak into any prestigious event, you just need to walk in there with the swagger and clothes as if you own the place, and 9 times out of 10, they'll let you in. And that's not good when it comes to things like conspiracy theories like anti-vax, but also Flat Earth and Heaven's Gate. I think a lot of people are buying these crazy stories because the person touting them says it with this unwavering air of confidence and nothing else. But let's bring it back to the world of entertainment. I'm not sure how to word this, but I feel like it's kind of flimsy to care about science in only the ways that movies and TV shows portray science. Here's the clearest example I can think of this. Back in the early 2010s, I was interested in astronomy, but I would also watch these reality shows like Big Brother, Survivor, Amazing Race, and so on, because Total Drama Island had got me hooked on them. I remember these reality shows would always cast one contestant of each archetype: the jock, the gossiper, the bossy type, and the nerd. And whenever the crew would film confessionals, they'd have the nerd ramble about some arbitrary, sciencey sounding jargon in a way that obviously didn't mean anything but just sounded nerdy. Like, let me use my electroplasma calculations to deduce a quantum Nero robot to win this challenge. And I would always think, is this what America thinks science is? Just another aesthetic for a cast member to adopt to fill a role, but it doesn't actually mean anything. It just felt a bit insulting and maybe babying, in the same way that Taylor Swift's lyric, "Hey kids, spelling is fun," was not fun. Like, I know the US is falling behind the world in a lot of educational metrics, and we want writing and math to be more palatable to kids who might be scared by it. But I think going gung-ho for palatability above all else is like, look, even you precious kids can handle this because we softened the corners. And that can come across as condescending. Now, when it comes to science representation in media, I know there should be a balance. Even I found the people who complained that George Clooney's rope should have been able to pull him to safety in Gravity a bit pedantic. So I'm not saying that every piece of media needs to be an exact clone of reality or teach an exact scientific curriculum to its audience. What I am saying is that if you fully rely on media for all you know about a field, your breadth of knowledge won't be very deep. Like, you can be a super fan of Dexter's Laboratory, memorizing all the episodes, but you still won't know much about science. And you can be a super fan of Law & Order SVU, but you still won't know much about criminal justice. And you can even be a super fan of the algebraians in BFDI, but you still won't know much about algebra, how to actually solve for unknown variables. To get to the nitty-gritty of how these disciplines actually work, you're gonna have to slog through years of unglamorous, unromanticized aspects of the field. And yes, that is obvious, but looking at the numbers, maybe it isn't obvious. Over and over, I've seen thousands of people role-playing as film critics to critique fiction, but I rarely see anyone wanting to roleplay as scientists to critique fact. I guess that's just inevitable though, because the threshold to become a scientist is so high, over 10 years to go from undergrad to PhD? Whereas the threshold to watch a show is just a few hours watching TV. I'm not placing any obligation on shows like Dexter's Lab to do any more than they set out to, which is just to entertain. What I do think about though is my own experience, having made both types of content. I made a purely entertaining show, BFDI, in 2010 to 13. Then, around 2015 to 17, I made videos about my coding projects, like evolution simulators. And I felt fulfilled seeing that the audience for those videos were people with experience in the CS field, who genuinely wanted to interact with the concepts I was trying to get across, such as gradient descent, data compression, convolutions, how to code on a GPU, etc. Then, in late 2017, our animation team started a 4th season of BFDI, BFB, and I was happy to see it get so popular. But I noticed for every CS video I made after that, there were many comments to the effect of, clicked because BFDI guy made it, but left after 5 minutes because my brain hurt. Or, whatever you say, Magic Computer Man, I just watch for the funny cartoons. And I noticed that if I didn't animate my videos with the silly stick figures, wacky faces, jokes, and screaming sounds, i.e. I didn't adopt the BFDI aesthetic people had come to associate me with, it would be hard to get people to care. I want to make it clear that along this whole journey, I had full creative control over what type of content I made. I myself chose to add the silly jokes, and I just as easily could have chosen not to. But there was definitely this growing feeling in me that if it was the whimsical animations that made my video enjoyable to my community, then what was even the point of spending weeks coding a deep neural network if all of that was secondary? If coding is the part of the video most of my audience clicks over every time I upload, why include it in the first place? But here's the thing, reflecting back on this last decade, I found that the most gratifying part of having made coding videos wasn't the bells and whistles, but it was honing in on the core concepts, like seeing how natural selection really did make creatures run faster to the right in a more organic and unpredictable way than a scripted animation could depict. And I worry that if younger kids decide, is evolution real or not, based on what visually looks the most entertaining on screen, then they may never get that same thrill I had when I first saw those scrappy triangles literally evolving on my computer in front of me. If we prioritize purely aesthetic over anything academic, then the battle for truth will be won by who can shove the most memes into the content as possible. And though I applaud the academics who try to make that effort, it is exhausting to keep up with all of that. As much as I was campaigning for professors to make edited lecture videos earlier in this video, I do not ever expect them to have to put skibbity toilet in their philosophy presentations, because even I can't muster the energy for that. Part 6. Conclusion. So my conclusion to all of this is that people could be a lot more effective if they focus on both the academic and aesthetic skill sets. In college settings, we could mitigate plagiarism or other unwanted behavior if we tell our arguments in the form of compelling stories from the heart, not from a syllabus. In online spaces, we could show a bit more deference to the academics who have spent years studying their field, even if it's less glamorous than the TV show that showed the same thing. But I don't think everybody has to become some prodigy who excels at everything. Rather, I wish people could make the effort to realize the world isn't just their bubble they've surrounded themselves with. If you love cartoons all day, left and right, that's fine. Just accept that not everyone is like that, and make an effort to engage with the boring, yet substantial, people on the outside. And if you're deep into the academic world, and you do research amongst your peers all day, I applaud you too. But it couldn't hurt to put some effort into making that research accessible for the everyday Joe to understand, even if that requires simplifying it a bit. I mean, who knows, maybe they could join you 10 years from now. Anyway, that's my video on the academic versus the aesthetic. Thanks for watching!